Hello, hello, and welcome. I'm Mehran Khalili. We are DM25, a radical political movement for Europe, and this is another live discussion featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. And tonight, we're looking at the conviction of Marine Le Pen, France's far-right leader. Last week, a Paris court found her guilty of misusing EU funds and banned her from running in the next presidential election. The thing is, Le Pen is a top contender for the French presidency, arguably the front runner, and this ruling has sent shockwaves around Europe and beyond. Because we're now in an era where the legal system is increasingly used across the world by political establishments to block their opponents and silence dissent, a tactic known as lawfare. So, was the Le Pen verdict justice served, or are we watching courts replace voters? What are the implications and dynamics of lawfare? Does barring candidates actually weaken extremism, or does it strengthen it? And of course, what can we, as active, engaged citizens, do about all of this? Well, we have a wonderful panel for you tonight. We have, of course, our own Yanis Varoufakis, and we've also got the host of System Update on Rumble, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Glenn Greenwald. And we have the Europe editor of the esteemed Jacobin magazine, David Broder, with us today. And of course, we have you out there. If you've got thoughts, comments, rants, ideas about lawfare, questions you always wanted to put to a panel like this, then please put them in the YouTube chat and we will put them to our panel. Please hit the bell icon if you would like to stay informed of whatever other YouTube videos we put out. And let's kick it off with Yanis. Yanis, you've said that this case represents the descent into authoritarianism of the political establishment. You've called the ruling mind-boggling. Can you elaborate on this view? Yanis, unfortunately, is having some technical problems. So Yanis will be rejoining us a little, but perhaps I can ask you, Glenn, to step in while Yanis reboots his computer. Let's start again.
Sure, I'm always happy to step in for Yanis. So if this were an isolated case, if, say, Marine Le Pen were charged with crimes under French law, got convicted, or banned from the ballot, I'm sure there would be suspicions, and I think it's warranted every time to have suspicions about lawfare whenever a person who's leading in the polls or very viable candidate to win a presidential race suddenly is banned from running because of a criminal conviction. I think those suspicions are always going to be warranted. But I think by and large, the discussion would be about the intricacies of French law, whether this is customary in French law or not. You have to talk about the, idiosyncrasies of French law. To me, it seems like a pretty penny ante case. I mean, I haven't followed it. I'm not a French lawyer. I haven't followed it every day, but there was no self-enrichment on the part of Marine Le Pen. Everybody admits that. It was really a case of kind of taking a EU salary and using it primarily to supplement the activists in her party rather than people actually working as EU legislative aid. So I don't know. It seems a very borderline case. But if it were just this, you would say, well, look, maybe under French law, this is taken very seriously. Under EU law, the problem is it's anything but isolated. We're seeing this clear trend where, we've seen lawfare for a long time, not just against the populist right, but many times against left-wing candidates as well. I have a lot of examples of those. But in the last decade, it's primarily been used against populist right candidates. The minute they start becoming too popular or likely to win an election, charges are not only brought against them, but those charges are weaponized to ban them from running, even though tens of millions of people, maybe a majority of the country, want to actually see them as president. Here in Brazil, where I have lived for quite a while, Jair Bolsonaro, who was elected in 2018, almost got reelected in 2022 when he lost to Lula, is at least tied with, if not a little bit ahead of Lula in current polls for 2026, can't run, even though at least half the country wants him to be president. Obviously, in the US, we saw that with Donald Trump leading into the 2024 election. The explicit goal of Democrats was to imprison him. They did actually succeed in getting him kicked off a ballot. We've recently seen it in Romania with Colin Georgescu after he won and they invalidated the election, now have banned him. And now we're seeing it with Marine Le Pen, and there's other examples as well. So at some point, the only way a justice system can really have efficacy is if the public perceives it as apolitical, as legitimate. And I think we're on the precipice, if not well past it, where even lots of people who don't like those candidates, I don't think Yanis is a fan of Marine Le Pen, I'm certainly not, start to really believe and suspect that the people who claim that they're saving democracy are actually the ones engaged in the most anti-democratic weapons to ensure they control and win elections.
Thank you, Glenn. Yanis, you're back now. Would you concur with what you've heard from Glenn?
Of course. Well, it's a great honor and a great joy to be on this panel, on the DiEM25 panel, with Glenn and David. Our paths have been crisscrossing for so long. Look, allow me just to say a few things, because I've been losing a lot of sleep over what's going on in Europe and beyond. Our conversation is not about Le Pen. It's not about any particular politician. I think it's more to do with what a principled position must be for a decent democratic left on the question of who has the right to remove the political rights, the right to vote and to seek votes, of whom. We know what can happen when political rights can be rescinded by the courts, en masse especially. Just look at the distortions of the American political system caused by the loss of political rights of ex-convicts. A huge proportion of America's working class, especially of Black Americans. We know, Glenn just mentioned that, what happened to Lula, before that Rafael Correa in Latin America. Catastrophic effects for their people. And we have seen how the pathetic legal efforts of the Democratic establishment in the United States to prevent Trump from running made the terrible thing grow impossibly awful. But looking at the Le Pen case in some detail, I think there are three questions that are quite separate that we need to address. The first one is, and I think Glenn asked me indirectly, what do I want? What do we want to see happen to Le Pen? The obvious answer is, Glenn and David, we want to see Le Pen and her mates get crushed at the ballot box, in the polling stations. We want the masses to turn away from her and from all her merry authoritarian and xenophobic friends. We want fascists like Le Pen, Trump, Musk, Orban to lose the discursive battle. We want them to lose politically. We want them to lose ethically. We want to see them fall from grace in the eyes of all decent people, not just us leftists. And we should be enjoying the sight of her hypocrisy in action, because you see how she protests. She compares herself to Martin Luther King. That the judges have delivered a verdict that includes her, instead of going to prison immediately, to wearing an ankle bracelet for 2 years. And why is this hypocritical of her? Because if she were president, if her party had won in France, then their authoritarian policy, heavy law and order policy, is against ankle bracelets and in favor of incarcerating everyone at the drop of a hat. So allow me to rephrase this question. Does banning her from participating in the next presidential election help do any of this? I think quite the opposite. As Glenn said, look at Bolsonaro. He was buoyed by lawfare. The ban turns in a fascist like Le Pen into a pseudo-hero. But of course, on its own, the fact that Le Pen and her mates, the Global Nationalist International, may benefit from lawfare, from being charged and banned and all that on its own is not a reason to dispute the ban, not on its own. So I come to the second question. Was Le Pen guilty of the charges? Did she improperly funnel resources from the European Parliament to her national headquarters? Here I can speak with some authority, I believe. I have no doubt that she did, that she is guilty. But let me place this in context. Let me tell you, because I happen to know how the system works from within. What happened? Members of European Parliament are given dazzling sums of money to employ staff, plus additional budgets to fund political work in their own home country. And let me be precise. If you're an MEP, you get a staff allowance of exactly 30,769 euros, 30,000, almost 31,000 euros monthly, which is more than enough to hire a PA, a researcher, a local constituency worker, and still have many thousands left over. And what happens is the leftover money is routinely sent to the national parties, whose funding from their national parliament is always tighter than Brussels. So cash-strapped party leaders from the left, the right, the center, almost always oblige their MEPs to send that money to the national party. So yes, Le Pen is probably guilty. Well, let me just add that. And in some cases, of course, it is true that some of the leftovers find their way in the pockets of relatives of the MEPs. I was just reminded of that because I remember a brutish member of the European Parliament once boasting in my presence that it was common in Brussels to employ one's husband or wife while sleeping with one's staff. So she was definitely guilty, but of a crime which is so widespread in the European Parliament that singling her out, and only when she's leading the opinion polls, and there is a serious chance of her being, declared the winner, the president of the French Republic, that smacks of selective justice. And selective justice is not something that a genuine Democrat can ever defend. But for argument's sake, let's agree that even if it is selective justice, that it must be done. What could the judge do? They present her with a case, which is an open shut one. They have no choice but to deliver a guilty verdict. Okay, let's assume that. Then there are two further issues, however, to consider. One concerns the indefensible use of the so-called provisional execution clause. In other words, Le Pen was banned from the election before her appeals were heard and exhausted. Well, that's how they stopped Lula da Silva in Brazil from running, so that the fascist Bolsonaro could win. And then when Lula's appeal was heard and the charges were dismissed, it was too late to stop Bolsonaro from becoming president. Does the left really want to say that the use of provisional execution is bad when used against our people, but quite all right when they are used against somebody like Le Pen? That, I think, would be an incredible own goal for the left. I come to the second issue. Should a conviction for any crime, mean the loss of political rights, of the right to stand in elections? Allow me to be very categorical on that. I say no. Political rights should never, under any circumstances, be suspended. And I think this is imperative. It is a principle worth fighting for. Now, who can forget, those of us who are old enough to remember those anguishing days, and Bobby Sands, the convicted IRA man, ran for Parliament and won a seat in the House of Commons from the Maze high security prison in Northern Ireland. Now, even Trump, had he been sent to jail by that New York judge, would still be able to run for president. And I think this is right and proper, and something that we Europeans must fight as a right for everyone. Which leads me to the last question. Should politicians be exempt from criminal charges just because they are running high in the polls? No, of course we should not, and I put myself in it too, as a politician. Think about it. If Le Pen's judges had guts, they should have thrown her in jail. No bracelets, what she wanted, what she's proposing as part of her awful law and order policy, but not ban her from running in the elections. Letting her out of jail, but banning her from the elections is a political gift to the enemies of democracy, who can then claim, as they do, as Le Pen does, and with some legitimacy, that democracy is a sham. Now, somebody can say, well, Yanis, what if a convicted murderer gets elected? Should he be allowed to run from prison? Of course they should. And if they win, despite their conviction, and they are elected by voters who know that they've been convicted, then we all have ended up with a delicious constitutional crisis that we deserve. And I don't believe that it should be up to a judge to resolve that. It should be up to our polity to do it. Because political rights should never be left to judges anywhere, ever. The moment you let the judiciary decide who can seek our votes, our oligarchies are bound to distort what little prospects of a democracy we have. I don't believe that any sensible progressive can trust the courts in an exploitative system for which the so-called separation of powers is at best a heroic assumption and at worst a ruse. It is as naive as to believe in an independent central bank. Believe me, there is no such thing. Some people understandably say to me that they are worried with the ease with which the panicking radical center bans an ultra-right opponent they think may beat them at the polls. They're right. Many progressives fear that the same courts and the same means will be used tomorrow to ban us. They will. In 2015, lest we forget, they shut down our banks to ban us, those of us who had been elected, from running the country. And, if that had not worked, they would have banned us from running for office. There's no doubt in my mind. Indeed, let me share this with you if you don't know it. A band of rightist lawyers tabled charges against me at the Greece's parliament for high treason. What was the high treason, the charge? The allegation that I undermined the national currency. And which was the national currency? The euro. Okay, there's a comical element to this. But the gist is that we, the left, have a duty to fear that what we're doing to Le Pen today, they will most definitely do to us tomorrow, if we rise up sufficiently in the polls. But that is not the principal reason why I oppose Le Pen's ban and why I think the left should oppose it, or the ban of that clown Georgescu that Glenn mentioned in Romania. We should oppose these bans because no one's political rights should ever be rescindable for any reason. As I said before, anywhere, ever. Having the guts to say that, especially in defense of the political rights of an abominable person like Le Pen, we should, a politician that we should want to crush at the polling stations, that is the moral clarifier. This is the litmus test for every radical Democrat, if the left is to be worth its salt.
Thank you, Yanis. I'm glad we got most of the audio there because you're having some internet trouble, but thank you very much for that analysis. David, if I can bring you in here. I mean, Yanis, there's a lot to unpack there in what Yanis said, and Glenn, I would also like your reaction after, but if we can just linger a little bit on the Le Pen case for the moment, since that was the issue at hand. You just arrived back from Paris, where you were attending the rally where Le Pen was defiantly talking about her reaction to the ruling. Tell me, what is the reaction? Where do things move forward in France from here? And what has the reaction been also from across the political spectrum?
Well, I should specify first that I was, of course, at the rally, reporting on the rally. The message
Good point.
sent by Le Pen, just to be clear, the message sent by Le Pen is that this isn't a judicial decision, it's a political decision. And I think it relates to something that Yanis said, which I agree with very much, which is about the nature of the crime itself. It's easy for her to say, well, I'm in politics, I'm committed to politics, I want to defend my base and my values. To that end, I hired people to work for our political cause. People who sympathize with Le Pen are not going to react in shock horror that this is some appalling abuse of public funds. I'm on the left, I'm a socialist. There is a long tradition of left-wing parties treating their parliamentarians as servants of their party and not that of the parliament. Right? The idea of a workers' representative on a workers' wage, giving the rest of their income to their party. Members of parliament, members of the European Parliament, are not elected technocrats or elected administrators. They're political figures. So we should be honest that the kind of practices that Le Pen was engaged in are rife across the political spectrum. Voters may consider them to be unjust. They are illegal, but I think that there's very little chance that people are going to throw their hands up in horror at this appalling abuse of office, because very many people just won't see it like that. in Le Pen's case, there is a great deal of hypocrisy. Her party has long called for the so-called moralization of politics, saying it was the only party with clean hands, in that drawing on the language of the anti-corruption trials in Italy in the early 1990s, which destroyed the mass parties, but ironically enough, helped pave the way for Silvio Berlusconi. Judges broke up the old mass parties and opened the way for someone with power outside of politics and with a media empire, Silvio Berlusconi, to make his way in. One of the main judges in the Clean Hands trials, Antonio Di Pietro, later said, well, the effect of the judge's actions, casting out all the corrupt politicians, was to create a void into which Berlusconi could step, and in fact into which right-wing populist parties did step. The action of judges taking candidates off the ballot, the act of judges removing politicians doesn't empower voters. It doesn't empower ordinary people. If in the current moment we're living through, the great crisis of democracy is that people don't feel that they have power over the decisions in their lives. They feel that decisions are being taken by others elsewhere. They feel that they're not able to effect political change. Then judges stepping in on their behalf isn't going to empower people. And that's why I think France Insoumise has been quite right to argue the way we beat Le Pen is at the ballot box, as the left-wing parties did in last summer's parliamentary elections. Our response to the far right is not to try and get them cancelled or kicked out or banned from running, but to mobilize people for a better political alternative. So Le Pen, people have been sharing a lot in the last few days, this video of her in 2013, calling for exactly the kind of automatic ban, exactly the kind of ban for life from running for election for people found guilty of abuse of office, for deviating public funds and so on. She has contributed to the political climate that she is now denouncing, where judges can rule people out of running for election. So she's been hypocritical in that sense. My problem is why the call for the moralization of politics, this call for judges to intervene, this call for people to be banned from running, this anti-political call which presents the work of politicians and parliaments as just a sort of burden on the public funds. My problem is, why has this rhetorical posture, long beloved of the far right, now become a cause célèbre of progressive liberals? Why are they treating Le Pen using this kind of argument? So I think that if we look at the likely effect on French politics, I mean, people have rightly pointed out that politicians of other political forces, other political sides, have also been subject to this kind of ruling in recent years. It's not that unique. But I think it will be quite easy for Le Pen's party to portray themselves as the victims, to say, we're marching towards power, now it's been struck down. But of course, it's not going to stop the force of ideas, the force of mobilization that their party has. After all, even in last summer's election, Le Pen wasn't on the ballot paper, and we saw 37% of French people vote for the National Rally. I think it's fanciful to believe that this is going to be the thing that's going to stop her party. And to really defeat it, we can't rely on judges, because they'll find another candidate, they'll run anyway, they'll be defiant, their base is riled up. As you said, I went to the rally on Sunday. It wasn't very impressive in terms of its numbers or size, but they have, I think, as Yanis rightly says, they've got a propaganda victory from this. In fact, the banning of Le Pen from running has changed this from a story about her hypocrisy and the abuse of public funds into a story about her being victimized. So even as her party actually does become more conformist with the European establishment on things like Euro membership, on things like NATO, on things like supporting Israel, even as the party merges with the mainstream center-right, it's able to present itself as a victim, as something that elites are trying to cancel. And I think that's a powerful propaganda weapon for them.
Thank you, David. Glenn, can I bring you back in for your reaction?
Yeah, sure. So I just want to use a couple concrete examples because as somebody who defends free speech quite robustly, one of the arguments I try and make for people on the left when they are open to the viability of using censorship as a weapon is I say, if you endorse this framework, if you construct this framework, it can very easily and likely will be used against you in the future. That's the argument Yanis is making about this weaponization of lawfare and the like, and David alluded to it as well. And I just want to say, you don't really have to imagine some future where that could be used against the left. In South America, it was repeatedly used against the left, and I think in a way that's very illustrative of what I think is the most important point here. I mean, we talked a little bit about Ecuador, where it was used against Rafael Correa. I remember in 2019 when Evo Morales won that election and they concocted voter fraud against him, drove him out of Bolivia under threats, where he took exile in Mexico. But Brazil is the example I know best because I've lived here. I was very personally involved in a lot of these events through my reporting. PT, the Workers' Party, which is Lula da Silva's, could not lose an election from 2002 to 2016. His main opposition was this sort of center-right, very establishment party, and they were just completely drained of vitality, charisma. They were just representing bankers. Nobody was interested in them. Lula was, this spectacularly charismatic, singular talent in politics. And he won in 2002 and 2006. And then he chose as his handpicked successor the first woman president. She was kind of an obscure bureaucrat, Dilma Rousseff, who won in 2010 and then in 2014, vanquishing every time this center-right faction. And in 2016, when Dilma was into her second term, they created this corruption scandal because Brazil's economy was suffering for a lot of different reasons. Commodity prices were falling. The 2008 financial crisis was still reverberating. And they exploited that lack of popularity to just invent this ridiculous corruption scandal, claiming that she had used this very obscure budgetary tactic called pedaladas, which in Portuguese means pedaling, but it's sort of this rotating debt tactic that is used all throughout the democratic world. And in the context of corruption in Brazil, I mean, it was like a tiny little speck, but they manufactured it and they impeached her. And so heading into 2018, her vice president was very unpopular, assumed the vice presidency. He was so hated by everybody. There was no chance he could win. Lula was intending to run again, continuing PT's success. And that was when they brought charges against Lula, corruption charges by this anti-corruption task force. And they not only imprisoned him, but banned him from running in 2018 at a time that he was leading. And the reason the establishment did that, I promise, was not to pave the way for Bolsonaro. They hate Bolsonaro. They hated Bolsonaro. They thought they were finally going to get this sort of center-right, pro-establishment, pro-banking figure in. But instead, by this point, you had delegitimized the entire establishment. And so anybody who represented the establishment, the center-left, the center-right, had been discredited, and that paved the way for Bolsonaro, who won this resounding victory against Lula's Workers' Party in 2018. And then the only reason why they let Lula out of prison, because the Supreme Court had repeatedly affirmed his convictions, they used the reporting I had done as a pretext, but the real reason they did was because they were desperate to get rid of Bolsonaro. Only Lula in all of Brazil could defeat Bolsonaro, and so they let him out, restored his eligibility to run. He ran, and he barely won, and now they're dealing with Bolsonaro's renewed popularity by now declaring him ineligible. And you can see the people in Brazil are starting to understand that the whole justice system has been politicized and corrupted, and it's driving anti-establishment anger and resentment and rage even further. It doesn't work. It may work in the short term if you ban the candidate who might win, but all you're doing is feeding into the establishment hatred that's giving rise to these right-wing populists and extremists in the first place. And this is what I think is the most important point. For me, what really happened was you had 2016 when you had the decision of the British people to leave the EU because of resentment that was directed toward Brussels, followed just 3 or 4 months later by Donald Trump's very shocking and for Western liberals traumatizing victory over the sort of monarch of neoliberalism and the establishment, Hillary Clinton. And that began this sense that Western liberals could no longer trust the public to be free. They couldn't trust them to have free speech on the internet because they were concerned that it would lead to people making decisions outside of their control. And then that turned into a refusal to trust the population to vote freely. And that was when you started seeing this kind of systematic attempt to not just defeat right-wing populists in the polls, not really to even do that at all, but instead to prosecute them, to unleash the law against them, to ban them from the ballot, to take away the choice from people in the first place. And the reason I find this so dangerous, beyond the principle that Yanis articulated, which I completely share, that if you believe in democracy, and remember, all this is being done by people who are waving the banner of democracy. We have to ban the Romanian candidate who won the election because he's anti-democratic and pro-Russia. Marine Le Pen is anti-democratic. Bolsonaro is anti-democratic. Trump is a threat to democracy. To save democracy, we have to ban them. Beyond that principle that if you believe in democracy, you should want the people to decide who they want to be their leaders, which is a principle I think is important. What happens is the Western establishment, the Western neoliberal establishment, never had to look in the mirror and say, why is there so much anti-establishment rage and disgust, so that now there's a lane for right-wing populists posing as opponents of establishment dogma? Like, what do we have to do to regain the trust of people, to abandon neoliberalism, maybe to become left-wing populists? They just didn't want to have to take responsibility. They didn't want to have to change. They didn't want to have to abandon their dogma. And the only alternative then, if you're going to stay hated, if you're going to cling to an ideology that has destroyed people's lives, is to become anti-democratic, to ban the most popular figures against you in order to ensure that you continue to win elections. And the more they do that, again, there may be some short-term gain. I don't know if Marine Le Pen will be banned through 2027. It seems like she will be. I don't know if Jordan Bordella or some other right-wing populist in France has any chance with the same kind of stature as she does. So it might produce some short-term benefit. But all it's really doing is feeding into this perception that people already have of the kind of status quo perpetuators, the neoliberal order, that they are corrupted, that they are the ones who are trying to silence people's voices. It's this elite, very far and distant, that won't even deign to try and convince the public that they should continue to vote for their candidates, because all they do instead is just ban the other candidates. And, again, you could debate every one of these cases individually, kind of argue over the legal intricacies of each, but the pattern is so clear. And I think you have to be very naive to think, and this is the Le Pen case, I think, personified, that all the right-wing populists who are rising in the polls, who are leading the polls to win, suddenly start committing crimes just in the nick of time to justify their banishment from the ballot, whereas all of the establishment candidates are just incredibly clean and law-abiding and driven by integrity. I mean, that was what made Dilma's impeachment in Brazil so hilarious, is you had the biggest thieves and crooks on the planet, people with tens of millions of dollars in Swiss bank accounts, standing up on the floor of the Congress saying, we can no longer tolerate Dilma Rousseff's corruption. And where, again, her corruption was very small, bore. And the same thing with Marine Le Pen, having followed her case. It's like, okay, I don't disbelieve that she's guilty, but it does seem like a very pedestrian sort of kind of corruption that I'm sure politicians across the spectrum engage in. But because there's a benefit or a kind of anti-democratic weapon sitting there to use against her, it's just continuing to destroy faith and credibility of these institutions and fueling this cycle more and more. And it is ultimately anti-democratic in the sense that the people who have been in power for so long can stay in power, not by convincing people that they deserve it, not by convincing people that their policies benefit their lives in any material way, not by convincing them that they are actually, uncorrupted, but instead just simply by eroding democracy. And there are some people who seem to see that. I think Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who I guess you could say is the leader of the French left, did seem to say, I think elections should be decided by the ballot after the Le Pen ineligibility. But typically when it comes to power, the desire to win, the desire to grab power from your political enemies is so visceral, so intense, that it's very easy to abandon those principles. And I just think it's going to make all these problems more entrenched, not go away.
Thank you, Glenn. Yanis, I see you nodding there, and I know that you have to leave us soon, so let me bring you back in.
There's absolutely nothing I want to add to that. I agree absolutely entirely. And I do believe that Jean-Luc Mélenchon has taken the right line presently. It's a difficult line to toe because of the, being squeezed by all sides, and not just on this matter, on Palestine, on everything. So, all strength to France Insoumise. And I have absolutely nothing else to add. This is one of the few times I've experienced that.
Okay. Stunning. Cool. Just on that point with regard to that you made there, Glenn, the charge being small potatoes, and also I think David also mentioned it. This is kind of a common practice. There's been a lot of reporting, including in Le Monde, that between 2019 and 2022, 1 in 5 MEPs were actually found to break the rules in exactly this way, diverting funds to their national parties, and they just had to pay back the money. The case never became public. So this certainly would lend itself to potentially looking like lawfare, something dubious. Some quick comments from the chat before I hand it to you, David. Ahmed says, ban them now. They will play the victim anyway. Better play the victim than be in power. Mauro says, Le Pen broke the law and she's going to pay for it, just like I would do if I stole someone else's money. What you call lawfare is actually accountability, end of story. I've heard this repeated quite often. And Alex Blue says, why should every voter need to be an expert on the crime and whether or not it was true? Don't we have courts to look into this and determine this for us? David, as I bring you back in, I want to ask you your take on this idea that it actually empowers the far right in this case, that they can, I mean, you spoke about it a little bit before. To what extent is that turning out to be the case, and what, if anything, can be done to head that off?
I'll just reply to the comment by Alex Blue you mentioned, which is, no, of course, every voter doesn't need to be an expert on the crime and make a legal ruling. The court is there for that. The problem is the principle that people convicted of crimes should or shouldn't be banned from running for public office as a result. It's perfectly fine for her to be convicted and for them people to decide whether or not they're going to vote for her anyway. Where my problem comes in is the reliance on the judicial authorities to pre-select candidates. And in this case, it seems quite obvious that even if she can't run, then her party is going to run perhaps Jordan Bardella as candidate. He will run his own campaign, but with her always there by his side, shouting about how she's been silenced. Her name is going to be central to the presidential election campaign, like it or not. So we're 2 years out from when the election will actually happen, and this has fired the starting gun on it. And what we're starting the campaign from is the most popular candidate was banned from running. I think that's very counterproductive. I think that doesn't work. I think that anyone should be able to stand, even if they are convicted. I must say, I'm not quite so convinced that by the idea, I think I disagree with you a little, Glenn, that this particular decision can be seen purely as the intention to take down the candidate from one political side. In fact, what I was saying before was what my problem is that a call that was previously raised by the far right, i.e., let's ban people from public office for misuse of public funds, has now been gleefully taken up across the mainstream politics. In fact, Le Pen called for the automatic ban before it was actually, obligatory ban on convicts running for public office. She called for it before it was introduced. So it's boomeranged on her. Other important political candidates have been subject to this kind of judgment too. For example, Francois Fillon, who was the main centre-right candidate in 2017, had a quite similar scandal, which resulted in 2020 in him being banned from public office. And he's certainly a pro-business, pro-NATO, whatever you like, candidate. In fact, at the rally on Sunday, it was quite funny when Eric Ciotti, who's like a former Gaullist, a former centre-right politician, who's now allied with Le Pen, he tried to link the two cases and say, well, we Gaullists, us centre-right, we were the victims of the left-wing establishment too. And then the crowd didn't cheer because they want to be the only victims. They want the far right alone to appear as a victim, which I think isn't quite true. I think the question of principle of whether people should be allowed to run and our judgment on the severity of the crime, and indeed separate from that, a political judgment on whether this will backfire, is separate from a judgment on Le Pen herself, a political judgment on Le Pen herself. I think she was very hypocritical. I think she herself fed this judicial populism. It's boomeranged against her, but I think it's bad for democracy in general, because the principle of judicial populism is to take power out of the hands of voters and parties and mobilization and to put it in the hands of the courts. The left has about a quarter to a third of the French electorate behind it. It can weigh seriously on the French electoral space. It's not just neoliberal centrists versus the far right. But if we're having a public debate, which is between rival claims of corruption and lawfare and about the politicization of the justice system, that also means we're not having an argument about social welfare, about distribution, about pensions, about the record of Emmanuel Macron's government. And I think that that's very damaging for democratic debate. And I think it actually pitches all politics in the direction of a kind of anti-politics of thinking nothing can come from the public sphere. Just as a final point on Le Pen's hypocrisy, I will note that even in recent months, her party called for Rima Hassan, a France Insoumise member of the European Parliament, to be stripped of her French citizenship on alleged apologia for Hamas. The opinions imputed to her are of course, entirely. That's not at all what she said. And of course, in France, we've also seen the repression of pro-Palestine protests. Didn't hear a word from Marine Le Pen and the far right about that. In Germany, where I normally live, we're having people deported for attending Palestine protests without even being convicted. So I think what I find very troubling is the increasing role of courts in delimiting the legitimate political space, trying to strike people down and ban them. And I think it's disempowering. I think it's the opposite of the kind of mobilization, the kind of mass democracy on which the left relies.
Thanks, David. Glenn, your reaction?
Yeah, so I think that point about how when you're talking about the validity of court rulings and electoral bodies rendering candidates ineligible, how that's a distraction from what politics ought to be focusing on, which are policies and whether that they're helping the ordinary voters' lives or whether they're harming them. That is true, but I also think that's the point. If you look at the elections in the United States over the last decade, Democrats have barely offered any kind of positive agenda. The agenda has been Donald Trump is corrupt, Donald Trump is a fascist, Donald Trump is a criminal, Donald Trump should be banned from the ballot. And I think a lot of Western neoliberals, not the left, but Western neoliberals are far more comfortable having the focus be on these court issues and process issues precisely because they don't really have an agenda that they offer. The left does, but as you said, the left is, even in France, a minority of voters. The establishment that is driving these kind of convictions do not want a focus on their ideology, because how can they justify how neoliberalism has done anything but gut the middle class, create downward mobility for the working class all throughout the West. So I think that's a feature and not a bug of using this lawfare, is exactly that you don't even have to convince the public any longer that the status quo ideology is a good one. I also want to say, obviously lawfare is not in any way reserved for populist right candidates. I mean, I talked, in fact, in about how in South America it's been long used, primarily against left-wing candidates. But I think the best example of how it can backfire is in the United States with Donald Trump. When Trump was president, they impeached him twice, the first president in history to very few have been impeached at all. He was impeached twice. And then when he was out of office and running again, and obviously a threat to win, they indicted him 4 separate times in 4 different jurisdictions, 2 federal, 2 state, all on felony charges. And they were open about the fact, Democrats were, that their strategy for 2024 was to convict him of as many crimes as possible and even force him into prison because they thought that would help them win. And and on top of the censorship that they used, banning him from X, banning him from Facebook. And voters saw this. Voters saw the criminal convictions in Manhattan. They saw the prosecutions for having classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, of being accused of trying to overturn the election. And it wasn't just that people weren't bothered, they perceived it as an abuse of the political system. That's how he depicted it continuously. And ultimately, because people hate establishment institutions and distrust them so much, it played into their anti-establishment fervor and it strengthened Trump even more. I mean, he won more solidly in this last election than he did in 2016. And I think that is the big risk with using this. And, the last thing I want to say is, about some of the comments that you read, I of course understand why some people on the left are eager to banish Marine Le Pen however you can do it. I don't care. Put her in prison, convict her, ban her from the ballot. I don't really care. Just as long as she's gone, I'm happy. The problem with that is that even if you don't care about the principle, it surprises me sometimes to hear people on the left say, oh, we trust the courts, let the courts handle it. We trust these institutions, they'll do the right thing. Because for so long, these institutions throughout Europe, in the United States, throughout South America and elsewhere, have been programmed in exactly this way against the left. I watched in 2022 when the CIA that openly was rooting for Lula to beat Bolsonaro because now these intelligence agencies regard right-wing populism as a much greater threat, not than hard leftism, but a sort of soft leftism that Lula represents, kind of center-left establishment leftism that they can live with. 30 years ago, the CIA would have been engineering a coup in Brazil against someone like Lula. In 2022, they went to Brazil and basically threatened Bolsonaro about talking about voter fraud, the integrity of the ballot box, warned him that there'd be severe consequences for Brazil. And a lot of people on the left said, oh, thank you, CIA. Thank you, to the United States government. And that's what worries me the most, is that if you start endorsing these kind of frameworks where just openly candidates who are leading in the polls are being declared ineligible, and you don't care if Marine Le Pen was singled out, you don't care if a bunch of people in the center and even the center left did the same thing she does, you don't care if only she were prosecuted for political reason, you're giving a kind of credibility and power not just to this framework but to these institutions that carry them out, that basically guarantee that that's going to be used against you. And I think this censorship stuff is a perfect issue. The left was cheering all the censorship against the right over the last decade. And now we see, the Trump administration and countries in Europe like Germany criminalizing protests against Israel, criminalizing pro-Palestinian protests, deporting people for the crime of criticizing the Israeli destruction of Gaza. And it's very hard, if you've been someone cheering the silencing of your political opponents through censorship over the last decade, to rise up and wave the banner of free speech with any credibility in order to defend that. It does require a principled defense, even when it's being used against your political opponents, as hard as that is, if you want to be effective when raising these values.
Thank you, Glenn. And I should add that while we're talking here about banning people from who are on the cusp of political power, lawfare can also be used against activists, against movements, individual activists. Obviously, Edward Snowden, as we all know too well, Julian Assange, etc. It's the same story. So yes, it can definitely be coming for you sometime soon. A lot of our audience are activists and active citizens. I want to linger a little though on that point that you just made, Glenn, which is that the fact that it backfires and makes if you outlaw something, it makes it more attractive. For me, that seems just totally obvious. If anyone that understands human nature would understand that. And yet, as you say, since 2016, the establishment doesn't seem to get it. So as I hand it over to you, David, I want to understand, why do they keep getting this so wrong?
Well, I think that there's an exaggerated belief in the center-left political establishment that this kind of accusation or even this kind of conviction is indeed damning, that people are indeed great believers in the established institutions, in Republican propriety, in the highfalutin values proclaimed by the French state. I think it's not an accident that they think like that, because a lot of people who are close to political power and institutional power probably do have those values themselves and think like that. But we have a great deal of examples to show that it doesn't work. I'm a historian of Italy. In Italy, throughout the 1990s, 2000s, early 2010s, the main centre-left force moved away from being a party that sought the votes of working class people for social democratic reforms to being a party that was against Berlusconi and that thought that showing how evil and awful he was the way to build an electoral coalition. So they brought together bits of the centre-right and lots of the centre-left. It's a bit like in the US case, the strategy of the Lincoln Project. Let's appeal to honest right-wingers, honest Republicans who don't like Trump, and that's how we'll create a social base to get rid of him. And what we see is that that kind of politics that's all about just, keeping the wolf from the door, getting rid of the awful, evil, corrupt sinner, that isn't going to mobilize masses of people to vote when what they're worried about is their own living standards, their own lives, their own careers, their own housing. So this kind of anti-corruption politics can serve as a kind of elite ideology to span the centre-left, centre-right divide. I'm very unconvinced that it's able to mobilize majorities. In the Italian case, what eventually happened was when, at the depth of the Eurozone crisis, the Italian president, Giorgio Napolitano, wanted to create a national unity government. The Democrats, the very people who pivoted the whole strategy on being anti-Berlusconi for 20 years, made a grand coalition government with him. They entered office together. Firstly, in supporting a technocrat cabinet, and then as an explicit alliance of their parties. Berlusconi was then banned from running for public office in 2013 on fraud charges. And what did we get instead? Well, we got Matteo Salvini taking over the Italian right instead, and now Giorgia Meloni. So you can get rid of the individual, you can convict the crook, but what you can't do is destroy their ideas or their social base or the things they're voting for. People vote for the Rassemblement National because they want less immigrants and less taxes. Those are the fundamental pivots of their support. They're going to vote for that anyway in 2027, even if Marine Le Pen isn't on the ballot paper. To contradict, to push back against those ideas and values requires mobilizing people who don't think like that and also eating into the far right's own base. I think the striking down of Marine Le Pen is very unlikely to help us progress in that direction.
Thank you, David. As we sort of close out this session, I'd like to look, as I mentioned, our audience are largely activists. So what could, Glenn, if I can ask you, like, is there anything that the left can do to sort of neutralize against this proactively? Is there anything as we go about our business that we can do to well, not prevent this necessarily happening to us, but if it does, to make the impact, well, to mitigate the impact, and what are those things?
Yeah, that's, I think, an important question. I began my journalism career working with, and I guess aligning with, dissidents, anti-establishment dissidents, Julian Assange first, but I've always, had a strong association and connection to pro-Palestinian protesters, other kind of protest movements, obviously Edward Snowden. And so anything that, that legitimizes the state creating frameworks to punish dissent, any kind of dissent from establishment dogma on the left or the right, I just, repel from instinctively, because even if it's being used one day against your political enemies, there's no doubt the next day it will be used against your allies. And we've seen that so many times. And I think the most important thing, I look, I'm human. I understand the temptation to punish your political opponents. When there's a politician I really hate and I see that they're being prosecuted or accused, part of me gets happy because I think the world would be a better place if they don't have power. The problem is that's like an immediate kind of primal instinct that doesn't have a lot of thought and reason behind it. And even if you are comfortable with that kind of, reasoning, like, yeah, I don't care if it's legitimate or not, just Marine Le Pen banned from the ballot is an automatically good thing. Even if that pragmatic rather than, I guess, ethical framework is what's driving you, it still is incumbent on you from a pragmatic perspective to think about what the consequences of that might be beyond just the immediate benefit. And I see the right now that have been pretending to be free speech advocates for the last 10 years because it was primarily censorship was directed against them, turning around and being very aggressively defending Trump's multiple attacks on dissent. But this time it's more coming from the left against Israel and those sorts of things. And I think they're doing themselves a huge disservice because the next time there's censorship against them and they stand up to wave the free speech banner, everyone's going to laugh in their face, deservedly so. And I think the challenge of any left-wing project is not just to quest for power in the most immediate way, regardless of the means, because that's what every political faction does. But it's to stand for some kind of principle that applies universally. And I think that's not just about rising above and unilaterally disarming. I think it makes a political movement much more effective and powerful and appealing over the long term. I think that's why the establishment has lost so much credibility and faith throughout the democratic world, because they stand for nothing other than the perpetuation of their own power. And that's not just amoral to me, but it's highly self-defeating as well.
Thank you, Glenn. And so the left needs to win the battle of ideas, basically, and not and not the battle of whose judges do what. David, if I can bring you in for a final comment.
Well, my final comment is to agree with Glenn's final point and hopefully to wrap together what I said earlier. The point of left-wing politics is not just to give people nice things or to keep the far right from power. The point of left-wing politics is to empower people, to give them more of a democratic say, to have more decisions over their own lives, to take part in running public life. Even if the judges were responding to laws, that the ban on office thing is something that comes from legislation, in fact, dating back to 1992 and then extended a few years ago, even if the judges are applying the law as written, controversial as that is, I think it's a bad thing for them to be striking people off the ballot paper. I think it doesn't empower democracy. It doesn't empower voters to take the decision into their own hands. As Yanis said earlier, I very much want to see Marine Le Pen defeated by people turning out, not just against her, but turning out to vote for something better, to turn out for a more generous, more solidaristic society, one that tackles problems like climate change, one that does things like stop support for Israel, one that doesn't plan the economic future on remilitarization. I want the French election campaign to be about all those things. Now I'm very worried that it won't be, and that we're going to spend the next 2 years talking about how Marine Le Pen has been cancelled. And I think that's a great shame.
Okay, good point. Thank you. As we close out, I just want to thank our panel and thank you out there for all your comments and for watching us. And if you would like to join DiEM25, go to diem25.org/join. If you'd like to donate to DiEM25/donate. Don't forget to catch Glenn on System Update on Rumble and read David in Jacobin and elsewhere. And we will see you at the same time, same place, 2 weeks from now. Take care.